Right, so Michael, what do you make of the fact that Ukraine and America are holding limited talks today? It seems just a couple of specific things they're discussing.
Yes, it's very important to the Ukrainians that they stay in the game, that they keep talking about drafts that they could live with of this peace plan, and try to prevent it just becoming an outright Russian drafted plan for surrender, which is what it was a couple of weeks ago when it was 28 points, and then it's been worked on a couple of times. It's been round the houses twice. So it was a Russian-dominated plan, then it was a European-Ukrainian plan, then it went back to being something in between. Now it seems to be back to a Russian plan, which the Europeans and Zelenskyy are trying to get back into. And there's a plethora of diplomatic meetings today and tomorrow, the coalition of the willing and so on. This is a very intensive diplomatic time because I think the Europeans and the Ukrainians realise that they have to try to head off the possibility that the United States will demand by Christmas that Ukraine signs up to a plan which is actually a surrender plan, which will leave them without the territory in the Donbass, which keeps them relatively secure, with no security guarantees that make any difference, and with every prospect that they will not be a viable state afterwards. So that's what they fear. And the only way of heading that off is to keep talking, to keep putting drafts together, partly, if not to convince President Trump, at least to convince those around President Trump that they are not the problem. It's the Russians who haven't moved, the Russians who've not given an inch since March, and it's the Russians who think now that everybody's going to bend to what it is that they say are their minimum conditions, which are that effectively Ukraine surrenders.
We know that President Trump wants a peace deal before Christmas. How likely, realistically, do you think that is?
Well, I'm sure he won't get a deal that is acceptable to everybody. But if by Christmas he doesn't feel as if they're close to something, then the danger is for the Europeans and for Zelenskyy that he then just pulls the plug on it and said, well, that's it, I tried, it's your fault that it hasn't worked, and I'm not now going to continue to give Ukraine the aid which we currently give in terms of intelligence help and help with targeting and allowing the Europeans to buy weapons from America to give to Ukraine. He could pull all of those things, and it would make Ukraine's life much more difficult if it tries to fight on. So the danger is that we get to Christmas, an acceptable plan is still not agreed between the two sides, and President Trump loses patience and, in a sense, punishes Ukraine for the fact that this thing is not going to work. I mean, that's a distinct possibility. It's not inevitable, but that's where we might end up in a couple of weeks' time.
It's interesting, isn't it, looking at Trump's jumpiness over deadlines with Ukraine compared to how relaxed he seems to be when Russia kicks the negotiations into the long grass.
Yes, I mean, he establishes deadlines all the time with the Russians, and then the Russians say, well, they're thinking about it and there are lots of issues to deal with, and so they just ignore it. And ultimately, Trump has never followed through on any of his threats to pressure Russia. I mean, he threatened them with supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine and then just backed off the threat after a phone call from Putin. He did impose sanctions on two Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. But interestingly, since he imposed those sanctions, which did worry the Russians at the time, they haven't followed through on them. And so Rosneft and Lukoil are now transferring oil at sea. They've got all sorts of workarounds. There's tanker routes now going, very, very circuitous routes. So they're back to selling the oil to the people they want to sell it to, because the United States is not following through on making those sanctions stick. So the Russians have learned, rightly or wrongly, but I think rightly, that whatever President Trump says, he won't actually follow through. He'll find ways to back off, because ultimately he doesn't want to pressure Russia, but he does want to pressure Ukraine. And there's a whole series of reasons for that. His attitude towards Putin, his attitude to Zelenskyy, but also the sense that ultimately President Trump thinks that there are deals to be done with Russia, economic deals over the next 40 or 50 years, and that they are much more important than what he thinks is at stake in an unprovoked war against Ukraine.